The only sound I could still hear at that moment was the thunder roaring overhead as my suitcase slammed onto the water-drenched tiles right in front of our porch. My name is Piper, a 19-year-old student who worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat, yet here I was, being discarded like yesterday's trash. My father, Gerald, stood blocking the main entrance with a face crimson from a blind rage that I had never witnessed before in my entire life. He grabbed my remaining belongings and hurled them into the mud while screaming that I was an incompetent daughter and a total disgrace to the Vance lineage. This sudden outburst was fueled by a web of lies spun by my older sister Savannah, who had convinced him that I stole $50,000 meant for my grandmother Eleanor's urgent heart surgery. I stood there paralyzed in the freezing rain of the most violent Arizona storm of the year, while watching Savannah's triumphant silhouette lurking behind the glass door. Instead of begging for mercy or screaming my innocence into the howling wind, I chose to maintain a heavy silence because I realized that the truth would never be heard in a house blinded by favoritism. I picked up my soaked bags and walked into the pitch-black night without offering a single explanation for the crimes I didn't commit. The truth about that missing money is buried deep within a digital trail that no one expects me to find, and why I chose to walk away in silence will only make sense once you see what happens 3 months later. Don't take your eyes off the screen because the revelation I'm about to uncover will leave you absolutely speechless. To help you understand why my father could so easily believe such a blatant lie, I have to take you back into the twisted dynamics that defined our household long before that storm hit. Following the passing of my mother years ago, our home in Phoenix became a place where affection was measured by perceived success rather than genuine character. My father, Gerald, struggled to manage the emotional void left behind, leading him to place an absolute and often blinding level of trust in my older sister, Savannah. He saw her as the shining star of the family, especially after she secured a position as a senior insurance adjuster, which seemed to validate his belief that she was the only one capable of carrying the Vance name with pride. Savannah was incredibly skilled at maintaining this polished facade of a successful professional, yet behind the designer handbags and expensive dinners she was drowning in a sea of high-interest debt caused by her addiction to a luxury lifestyle she could not afford. While Savannah was busy performing for Dad and curating a perfect image, I spent almost every waking hour at the hospital providing direct care for my grandmother Eleanor, who was enduring a grueling series of cardiovascular treatments. I was the one who sat through the long nights listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitors and coordinating with the nurses while my sister was out at high-end bars downtown. Our stepmother Beatrice had joined the family a few years prior, and she masterfully maintained a neutral stance that masked her true intentions. In reality, Beatrice frequently aligned herself with Savannah to subtly isolate me from any significant family discussions or financial decisions regarding our household. This quiet alliance ensured that my voice was often drowned out by their synchronized praise for each other, leaving me as an outsider in my own home, despite my constant presence at Eleanor's bedside. The first signs of something being terribly wrong began to surface when the hospital's billing department informed me that the payments for my grandmother's essential medications were starting to fall behind schedule. This was deeply confusing because I knew for a fact that Dad was consistently handing over large sums of cash to Savannah, with the specific instruction to settle those medical accounts every week. Whenever I tried to bring up these late notices during dinner, Savannah would quickly dismiss my concerns by claiming there was simply a clerical error at the hospital that she would handle personally the next day. Beatrice would usually chime in at that exact moment to redirect Dad's attention towards Savannah's latest professional achievement, effectively silencing me before I could present any of the physical notices I had collected. The simmering tension between us finally reached a breaking point during a quiet afternoon in the kitchen, when I decided to ask Savannah directly about the $50,000 Dad had set aside specifically for Eleanor's upcoming heart surgery. I had noticed that the designated savings folder in our shared home office felt unusually light, and my intuition told me that my sister's sudden influx of new jewelry wasn't coming from her regular paycheck. Savannah didn't even look up from her phone as she leaned against the marble counter with a cold, dismissive smirk that made my blood run cold. She told me to mind my own business and reminded me that a part-time student like me had no right to question how the adults in this family managed their finances. That conversation was the moment I realized Savannah wasn't just being irresponsible with money, she was actively gambling with our grandmother's life to cover up her own failures. 4 weeks before that fateful stormy night, the atmosphere inside the Vance household began to grow suffocating as Savannah started making her final moves. My sister had become increasingly bold in her desperation to erase the growing evidence of her financial failures before our father could notice. She began surreptitiously accessing my personal documents and digital accounts while I was away at the hospital tending to Eleanor. Savannah used my identity to execute several unauthorized bank transfers and small loans, which effectively redirected funds away from our grandmother's medical fund and into her own debt-ridden accounts. I noticed that several of my sensitive files in our shared home office had been moved out of place, but I couldn't yet prove that she was the one behind the tampering. One afternoon, while I was returning from a double shift, I caught a glimpse of Savannah having a hushed and heated argument with a suspicious-looking stranger right in front of Dad's auto parts shop. The man was holding a thick folder and seemed to be demanding immediate payment for an overdue debt that Savannah had clearly been hiding from the family. She looked visibly shaken as she handed him an envelope that looked far too thin to settle whatever significant amount he was asking for. When she spotted my car pulling into the lot, she quickly dismissed the man and walked inside the shop with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. I knew then that her situation had escalated beyond just a few unpaid credit cards and was now threatening the safety of our father's business. Beatrice played her part in this growing deception by intentionally complicating the household expense logs so that Gerald would remain oblivious to the sudden disappearance of the surgical funds. She would often rearrange the receipts and billing statements to make it appear as though the $50,000 had already been earmarked for hospital deposits. Whenever Dad sat down at the kitchen table to review the monthly finances, Beatrice would distract him with trivial household issues or exaggerated stories about Savannah's supposed professional promotions. Their combined efforts created a thick fog of misinformation that prevented my father from seeing how close Eleanor's life-saving surgery was to being canceled. To further secure her position, Savannah began staging a series of elaborate scenes to make it look like I was the one indulging in an extravagant and irresponsible lifestyle. She used a specialized software to mask her location and placed several high-end luxury orders online using my name and shipping details to create a false paper trail. Several expensive packages began arriving at our doorstep while I was at my part-time job, making it appear as though I was squandering money that I didn't have. When Dad questioned me about these deliveries, I was completely blindsided by his accusations because I had never even visited those websites, let alone made such expensive purchases. The mounting pressure finally led to a direct confrontation in the kitchen one evening when I cornered Savannah and demanded that she return the medical money before it was too late for our grandmother. I laid out everything I had observed regarding the stranger at the shop and the mysterious packages that were clearly meant to frame me for her greed. Savannah stood her ground with a chilling lack of remorse as she poured herself a glass of wine and stared me down with absolute contempt. She leaned closer and whispered harshly, "Do you really think Dad is going to believe a part-time student like you or an insurance professional like me, Piper?" I looked her straight in the eyes and replied firmly, "You stole that money from Eleanor Savannah, and I am not going to let you get away with this." Savannah merely laughed at my warning and walked away, leaving me standing alone with the realization that my own sister was willing to sacrifice everyone we loved just to protect her failing reputation. Exactly at 7 o'clock on the evening of October 14th, a carefully orchestrated confrontation took place right in the middle of the Vance living room. The air felt heavy as Gerald stood by the fireplace holding a handful of crumpled papers that he had supposedly found tucked away in my bedroom. He began shouting at the top of his lungs while waving several forged bank withdrawal receipts that featured my name in bold letters at the top of each page. These documents had been sloppily hidden under my mattress earlier that day, making it appear as though I were a clumsy thief who couldn't even bother to conceal my crimes. My father looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and deep disappointment as he demanded to know why I would betray the family in such a cruel manner. I tried to speak, but the sheer volume of his anger made it impossible for my voice to be heard over his accusations. Savannah sat on the velvet sofa and began crying soft, practiced tears that were designed to evoke maximum sympathy from our grieving father. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and claimed that she had spent weeks trying to stop me from making these irresponsible financial choices. According to her story, she had caught me multiple times browsing luxury travel sites and had pleaded with me to think about Eleanor's surgery instead of my own selfish desires. Savannah insisted that she had kept my secret out of a misguided sense of sisterly loyalty, hoping that I would eventually return the stolen funds before the hospital deadline arrived. Her performance was so convincing that Dad actually moved to comfort her, further cementing the image of me as the heartless villain in this domestic tragedy. Beatrice then stepped forward with a calm and calculated demeanor to provide the final piece of evidence that would seal my fate for good. She presented a printed bank statement that she had fabricated to show a series of secret transfers into an offshore account that I had never even heard of before. This document was the ultimate blow to my credibility because it provided a logical explanation for where the $50,000 had disappeared to so quickly. Beatrice sighed deeply and told Dad that she had tried to balance the books for weeks, but the deficit caused by my alleged theft had become impossible to hide any longer. Gerald looked at the numbers and then back at me, his eyes hardening into a cold stare that told me the bond of fatherhood had finally snapped. Every single explanation I attempted to offer was immediately dismissed by Gerald as another desperate lie from a daughter he no longer recognized. He refused to listen when I pointed out that the signatures on those receipts didn't even match my own handwriting, or that I had been at work during the times of the supposed withdrawals. Dad saw my defense as nothing more than a pathetic attempt to shift the blame onto Savannah, who was still sobbing quietly into her handkerchief. He told me that stealing the life-saving money meant for his own mother was a betrayal that no amount of time or apology could ever truly erase from his heart. The man who had raised me was now looking at me as if I were a complete stranger who had intentionally brought destruction into his home. The scene reached its peak when Gerald stood up and pointed a trembling finger toward the front door while the storm began to howl outside the windows. He declared in a voice that shook the entire room that I was no longer his daughter and that I was officially disowned from the Vance family starting this very second. He stepped toward me and screamed, "You have effectively killed your own grandmother with that disgusting greed, Piper, so get out of my house immediately." I grabbed my coat and looked at the three people who had just destroyed my life before turning back to the man I once called my hero. One day, Dad will find himself filled with regret for choosing to believe Savannah instead of trusting his own daughter, I said, as I walked out into the pouring rain. 72 hours after being heartlessly expelled from my own home, I stood in front of a weathered law office in downtown Phoenix to seek a desperate chance for a counterattack. My name had been dragged through the mud, but I refused to let Savannah's lies become the final chapter of my life. I was there to meet a private investigator and old friend named Logan Marshall, who possessed a deep understanding of the loopholes in insurance records and complex online banking transactions. Logan Marshall had spent years navigating the murky waters of financial fraud, and he was the only person I could trust to help me dismantle the elaborate facade my sister had built. He listened intently as I described the forged receipts and the mysterious packages, his expression hardening as he realized the sheer scale of the deception. Logan Marshall immediately began the grueling process of tracing Savannah's digital footprints and financial history across several encrypted platforms. After 48 hours of intense investigation, he discovered that she had been funneling our grandmother's medical funds into a series of offshore accounts linked to a high-stakes international gambling site. The money meant for Eleanor's heart surgery was being used to settle massive losses Savannah had incurred during her secret trips to illegal casinos. Logan Marshall managed to secure a digital paper trail that clearly showed the timestamps of these transactions, many of which occurred while Savannah claimed to be at her corporate office. This evidence provided the first concrete proof that my sister's professional success was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. In order to fund this investigation and cover my basic living expenses, I began working exhausting shifts at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. I spent my nights serving coffee and cleaning tables until my hands were raw, barely catching a few hours of sleep before meeting with Logan Marshall to review his latest findings. The physical toll was immense, but the burning desire to clear my name kept me moving forward even when my body wanted to collapse from fatigue. I used every cent of my meager tips to pay for the specialized software Logan Marshall needed to bypass the security layers Savannah had installed on her personal devices. Every hour spent at that diner was a reminder of what I had lost and what I was fighting to reclaim from the people who had discarded me. Our breakthrough came when Logan Marshall uncovered a series of scanned documents hidden in a secondary cloud storage account belonging to Savannah. They discovered that she had meticulously forged the signature of my father, Gerald, on several legal authorization papers to gain full control over the family savings. This allowed her to withdraw $50,000 in cash directly from the bank without ever alerting the staff or raising Dad's suspicions. Savannah had also compromised Beatrice's digital login credentials to manipulate the household budget logs from a remote location, ensuring that the missing funds remained undetected for months. The level of planning involved in this scheme was breathtakingly malicious, showing that my sister had calculated every move with the intent of destroying me if things went wrong. As we reviewed the final set of incriminating documents, Logan Marshall looked at me with a somber expression and warned me about the gravity of the situation we were about to create. He explained that exposing Savannah's crimes would do much more than just recover the stolen money, because the evidence we had gathered was enough to send her to prison for over a decade. Logan Marshall leaned back in his chair and asked, "This evidence is enough to put Savannah in prison for 10 years. Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this, Piper?" I looked at the files spread across the desk and thought about the cold rain of that stormy night when my family turned their backs on me. "She didn't consider me her sister when she threw me out on the street, Logan, so I have no reason to show her any mercy now," I replied with a cold determination. Entering the second month of my disappearance, the cracks in Savannah's meticulously crafted lies began to show clearly as the hospital issued its final notice. Our grandmother Eleanor had physically collapsed because the surgical funding was non-existent, leaving her in a critical state without the life-saving procedure she desperately needed. Despite this dire situation, Gerald remained stubborn in his conviction that I had stolen every last cent of the medical fund before vanishing into the night. He spent his days pacing the hallways of the hospital while blaming my alleged greed for the decline of his mother's health. Savannah tried to maintain her composure, but the pressure was mounting as the hospital administrators demanded immediate payment to keep Eleanor on the priority transplant list. Savannah began to show signs of genuine panic when her old creditors started showing up at the family house to demand repayment for her unpaid gambling debts. These men were no longer interested in her excuses and began placing immense pressure on Beatrice to settle the new loan Savannah had secretly taken out in Dad's name. Beatrice found herself caught in the middle of a dangerous game as she realized that her stepdaughter's financial black hole was far deeper than she had ever imagined. The constant threats from these debt collectors made it impossible for the two of them to maintain the facade of a stable and successful household. Savannah's arrogance was slowly being replaced by a desperate need to find more money, but she had already exhausted every available resource within the family. The situation took a sharp turn when Gerald accidentally overheard a disturbing phone conversation between Savannah and Logan Marshall. My investigator friend had called the house while pretending to be a senior bank representative conducting a routine audit of suspicious transaction patterns. Logan Marshall used a professional and authoritative tone to ask Savannah about several large withdrawals that didn't align with the family's historical spending. Gerald stood silently in the hallway and listened as his favorite daughter stammered through a series of contradictory explanations that made no logical sense. For the first time since that stormy night, a seed of doubt was planted in his mind as he watched Savannah's face turn pale while she struggled to end the call. During a late-night shift change at the hospital, I managed to secretly slip into Eleanor's room to visit her while Dad was away getting coffee. I held her hand for a brief moment and left a folder containing internal documents that Logan Marshall had gathered during our investigation. These papers showed that an insurance firm had been secretly monitoring Eleanor's case and had noted several irregularities in how her medical claims were being filed. I wanted my grandmother to know that I hadn't abandoned her and that the truth was finally starting to emerge from the shadows. I disappeared back into the hospital corridors before any other family members could spot me, but the presence of those documents would soon act as a catalyst for the coming confrontation. Beatrice eventually realized that Savannah was sinking deeper into a criminal quagmire and began making plans to withdraw from the alliance to avoid legal consequences. She saw that the evidence was becoming undeniable and didn't want to be dragged down alongside Savannah when the authorities eventually arrived. During a heated argument in the kitchen, Beatrice made it clear that she would no longer provide cover for the missing surgical funds or the forged signatures. Beatrice looked at Savannah with a cold and calculating gaze and said, "If this entire scheme falls apart, I will tell everyone that I knew nothing about your choices, so you better handle this yourself." Later that evening, Gerald returned to the hospital to find Eleanor clutching the papers I had left behind, her eyes filled with a silent plea for him to look closer at the truth. I watched from the shadows of the waiting room as he read through the findings, his hands beginning to tremble with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning rage. "Grandmother is dying right now, Dad. So are you really going to stand there and watch Savannah spend the last of our family's dignity?" I whispered from the doorway before turning away. 90 days since that stormy night, I walked into the Vance living room for the last time carrying a folder that could crush everything my sister had built. The house was filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses because Savannah was hosting an elaborate party to celebrate a fake promotion she had supposedly received at her insurance firm. My sudden appearance in the doorway caused an immediate silence to fall over the room, while Gerald looked at me with a mixture of shock and renewed fury. He stepped forward as if to physically remove me from the premises, but the cold determination in my eyes made him hesitate for the first time in months. I didn't say a word as I walked toward the center of the room and placed the thick file of evidence directly onto the mahogany coffee table. Logan Marshall entered the house right behind me and immediately set up a portable projector to display the undeniable truth onto the white living room wall. The guests watched in stunned silence as a series of high-definition security videos began to play, showing Savannah withdrawing large sums of cash from various ATM locations across the city. The timestamps on these recordings clearly proved that these transactions occurred during the exact hours I was attending my university lectures or working my shifts at the diner. Savannah's face turned a ghostly shade of white as she watched her own image on the screen, her confident smirk finally dissolving into a mask of pure terror. My father looked from the screen to his favorite daughter, his mouth hanging open as the reality of her deception began to pierce through his stubborn pride. The presentation continued to expose the full extent of her crimes by showing her entire history of gambling debts and the digital logs of her transfers to offshore betting sites. Logan Marshall provided a detailed breakdown of how Savannah had used Eleanor's surgery money to chase her losses until there was nothing left but a trail of forged documents. Beatrice stood frozen in the corner of the room, her eyes darting toward the exit as she realized that her own role in complicating the household ledgers was about to be scrutinized. The guests began to whisper among themselves while they realized they had been invited to celebrate a woman who had essentially left her own grandmother to die for a few hands of poker. Gerald gripped the back of a chair so hard his knuckles turned white, his gaze fixed on the bank statements that proved every accusation I had made 3 months ago. The tension in the room reached a breaking point when 3 local police officers entered the house to execute an official arrest warrant for Savannah. They moved through the crowd with professional efficiency and ignored her desperate pleas for them to stop what they were doing. The lead officer informed the entire room that Savannah was being charged with large-scale identity theft, forgery of legal documents, and the embezzlement of medical funds. Seeing the handcuffs click around her wrists was the ultimate validation for all the nights I had spent crying in the rain or working until my body ached. Savannah looked at Dad and begged him to help her, but for the first time in her life, her manipulative tears had absolutely no effect on the man she had betrayed. Gerald collapsed completely into a nearby armchair as he realized the magnitude of his mistake and the cruelty he had shown toward his most devoted daughter. He looked at me with eyes that were filled with a profound sense of shame and a desperate need for forgiveness that I wasn't yet ready to give. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm that had driven me away, marking the end of the Vance family's era of favoritism and lies. I stepped closer to my father and looked him directly in the eyes before the officers led Savannah away from the house. This is the entire truth that you refused to hear 3 months ago, and now it is simply too late to fix what you broke, Dad, I said, with a voice that didn't tremble. The lead officer turned to my sister and stated firmly, "Savannah Vance, you are under arrest for fraud and the forgery of medical documents." As they escorted her out the door, I felt a strange sense of emptiness replace the anger that had fueled me for so long, knowing that while the truth was out, the family we once were was gone forever. 1 year after those life-altering events, I sat in my new apartment in Phoenix and felt the true meaning of peace for the first time. The justice system had worked its slow course and finally delivered a verdict that reflected the severity of Savannah's betrayal against our own blood. Savannah received a sentence of 7 years in prison and was ordered by the court to pay full restitution for every dollar she had embezzled from the family. Her career in the insurance industry was permanently over because her professional license was revoked following the criminal conviction for large-scale fraud. I heard from Logan Marshall that she spent her first few months behind bars in total denial, still trying to blame everyone else for the choices she had made. The luxury lifestyle she had tried so hard to steal had been replaced by a small cell and the crushing weight of her own greed. Gerald faced a much more somber reality as he attempted to salvage what was left of the Vance family legacy in the wake of the scandal. He tried to sell his auto parts shop to cover the massive debts Savannah had incurred, but the financial damage was too extensive to repair. Eventually, he was forced to declare bankruptcy and lost the family home, along with the business he had spent his entire life building. My father now lives alone in a cramped and dim rental apartment on the far side of the city, far away from the prestige he once craved. He spends most of his days in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of a family that he allowed to be torn apart by his own blind favoritism. The man who once stood tall as a provider is now a broken shadow of himself, haunted by the memory of the night he threw me out. Beatrice proved her true character by filing for divorce from Gerald almost immediately after the police led Savannah away in handcuffs. She managed to secure a portion of the remaining liquid assets before the bankruptcy proceedings could freeze the family accounts, and then vanished from Phoenix without a single word. No one has heard from her since that day, and it became clear that she was never truly invested in the family beyond what she could gain for herself. Her departure left Dad with nothing but the realization that the woman he had trusted above his own daughter was only loyal to her own survival. The house that was once filled with her calculated smiles is now empty, and her name is never mentioned by any of us who remain. I took the insurance compensation that I had fought so hard to reclaim and used it to move Eleanor into a highly respected rehabilitation center. My grandmother is finally receiving the specialized care she deserves, and her health has stabilized significantly now that the stress of the financial theft is gone. I visit her every weekend, and we spend our time talking about the future rather than dwelling on the darkness of the past year. Seeing her smile as she recovers her strength is the greatest reward for all the hardship I endured while living on the streets and working at the diner. She is the only person from my old life who truly understands the cost of the truth, and our bond has only grown stronger through this ordeal. The most difficult moment of this past year occurred when Gerald tracked down my new address and came to my door to beg for my forgiveness. He stood there looking old and frail, sobbing as he confessed that he had been a fool to choose Savannah's lies over my unwavering loyalty. I looked at the man who had raised me and felt a profound sense of sadness, but I knew that I could never go back to the way things were before. I stood my ground and told him that my forgiveness was not something he could simply ask for after the way he had treated me. I looked him directly in the eyes and said coldly, "My trust in you died on that stormy night when you threw my suitcase into the street, so please do not come back here again." Through this painful journey, I have learned that one should never place blind trust in anyone based solely on their outward reputation or status. It is a dangerous mistake to assume that success or professional standing is a substitute for genuine integrity and character, even among family. I also realized that honesty and devotion will always find a way to triumph over deception, no matter how deep the lies are buried. I am finally free from the shadows of the Vance household, and for the first time in my life, I am living for myself.
Trước khi kết thúc câu chuyện đầy nước mắt của Piper ngày hôm nay, các bạn đừng vội bỏ qua. Có những sự thật mà chúng ta cần phải thẳng thắn nhìn nhận cùng nhau. Tôi tin rằng trong cuộc sống này, niềm tin là thứ dễ vỡ nhất trong tương lai, thường bị đặt nhầm chỗ nhất. Người cha trong câu chuyện đã sai lầm khi đánh giá con gái qua vẻ hào nhoáng bên ngoài mà quên mất lòng hiếu thảo và sự thật nằm ở sự tận tụy âm thầm bên giường bệnh. Sự trả giá của Savannah và Gerald không chỉ là hình phạt của pháp luật, mà là bài học đắt giá về nhân quả. Sự gieo dối trá sẽ gặt lấy sự cô độc. Cảm ơn các bạn đã lắng nghe và đồng hành cùng kênh đến những giây phút cuối cùng này. Sự ủng hộ của các bạn là động lực để tiếp tục chia sẻ những câu chuyện giá trị hơn. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại.